Good afternoon. I'm Sylvester Johnson, Director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our Faculty Research Colloquium. I want to recognize and appreciate Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum, which is the digital hub at Virginia Tech, and Dominique Francesca, the business manager for the Center for Humanities, for their work in making this event possible. I want to make a quick reminder that at the same time on Thursday, March 31st, Professor Philip Yare will present his work on seizing citizenship, examining Frederick Douglass's abolitionist republicanism. So please mark your calendars for that. Now, today, we are joined by Professor Amoria Armstrong. Dr. Armstrong is an assistant professor of race and American religion and culture at Virginia Tech. Her research cuts across the fields of Black studies, American studies, political theology, and continental philosophy of religion, and she explores the relationship between religion and the reproduction of race in the aftermath of 1492. One of her current book projects, Reproducing Peoplehood, on the Afterlife of Christian Order, examines Black feminist theories of reproduction, American religious history, political theology, and Black women's post-Reconstruction literature, and it examines how the reproductive is critical for understanding the racial afterlife of Christian peoplehood. She's also writing a book on James Cone's Black liberation theology, and her research on W.B. Du Bois, Horton Spiller's Black culture, and political theology has been published in multiple venues. I want to remind our audience that we are inviting your questions and your comments. About halfway through our program, we'll pause to engage with those. So at any time, you can click that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window if you're joining us through the Zoom webinar, and you can send us your questions and your comments. And we'll, again, send those anytime, but about halfway through, we'll stop for those. But now, without further ado, Professor Amoria Armstrong, we're delighted you're here with us, and welcome.
Thanks for having me, Sylvester. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm excited to share this work in progress. It's just really me trying to think through some newer ideas. So I'm excited to hear people's thoughts and also get to share this fantastic and completely bonkers novel by Pauline Hopkins, Oath and Blood, which I think is amazing and also is one of the most bananas kind of 19th century novels I've ever read. So I'm excited to get into that. Okay, let me go ahead and share the screen. I don't actually have like a ton of slides, just a little outline and cover slide, but I thought it would be nice for people to have something to look at while this is happening. So let's see. Okay. Conjuring Kinship. So this paper is really trying to think through several sets of questions, some of which have to do with questions about kinship, loss and reproduction, and Black studies, and others of which have to do with the idea of Black theology, how it's often understood as a kind of confessional discourse, and what kind of possibilities there are for thinking of Black theology in kind of Christian, non-confessional terms. So I'm kind of trying to think through those questions with Pauline Hopkins' novel and how she brings together ideas of conjure and kinship in the novel. So I'm going to be reading from the paper as I go. Loss and reproduction often travel together. The crises of reproduction express the loss of a sense of futurity, of kinship, of continuity. Mingling together, the two create a sense of melancholy and mourning that become both an existential and epistemological problem for Black thought, for Black living and dying. In contemporary Black studies, confronting loss and its imbrication with reproduction is critical to confronting the material and abstract situation of racial slavery, and its afterlife. In many ways, the question of what to do about Black loss and Black reproduction is always being asked, even if unspoken. Turning to or away from politics and or religion are regular movements in the attempt to address the loss and crisis that Black reproduction marks. And it's the figure of the Black maternal that seems to suture the political and the religious. She registers as the sign of loss and crisis in need of salvation, or becomes the figure of the suffering servant whose loss mobilizes imagination and action. Whether cast in redemptive terms or pessimistic ones, Black reproduction comes to signify the transformations and losses of kinship that racial slavery inaugurates, the ongoing effects of that loss in the present, and the horizon of thought, imagination, and action constrained by the picture of existence and knowledge painted in the New World Project's fabrication of reality. This talk shows how Pauline Hopkins of One Blood provides a creative method for developing non-confessional approaches to Black theology that foreground Black cultural practices of conjure as a means of working with Christian theological materials, given their ties to the history of racial slavery. So Hopkins, I argue, shows how these materials might be wielded in impure ways to challenge the authority of the reality fabricated by white orderings of kinship and knowledge, rather than the purity of the blood that comes to be figured through Orthodox Christian and secular belief and boundaries around different forms of knowledge production. Her novel's revelation of the hidden and repressed things of the world, particularly of the racial order, make redemption an always already impure possibility. By illuminating the Black sense of invention, Hopkins shows African Americans' creative reuse of the natural and supernatural materials of existence. So just to give a little outline of the presentation, I'm just going to do a little definition of conjure, and then I'm going to go into more of a summary of the novel and how I see Hopkins kind of conjuring kinship in this novel. Then I'm going to deal a little bit
It seems that our presenter might have had some technical problems, which is not unprecedented, as we have learned during our pandemic period, but Memoria should be rejoining us in a moment. She was preparing to explain some of the insight from Pauline Hopkins' novel, which is an important part of the work that she's doing to interpret this history of race and religion and reproduction in the 19th century. So we'll give her a moment to rejoin us. And we'll see if we can get her back quickly. But unfortunately, as we have found many times, we have been very fortunate to have these digital platforms, but sometimes they are susceptible to the uneven bandwidth service that is available. So let's give her a moment to rejoin us. And also for those of you who joined us after our introduction, this is Amoria Armstrong, who is a professor in the Department of Religion and Culture, and whose work is examining American religion and race and gender, particularly focusing on reproduction. So we have a message here that Amoria is working on getting back to us, but just having some connectivity issues. And also a reminder for the audience, if you are joining us since the introduction, please remember to send us your comments or your questions using that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You don't have to wait until we start the Q&A session. You can send those anytime, and then we can queue them up for our presenter. So feel free to do that during the presentation. And it looks like she is about to rejoin us now. So,
hi, Zoom kicked me out.
No worries. That has not been unprecedented. I have been in the middle of more than one presentation presenting myself, and all of a sudden I just disappeared from the Zoom world and got back on. That's the nature of technology. But
wonderful. Okay.
Yeah, I'll give you. Did you need to restart your slide deck, or?
Oh yeah. I'll share the screen again.
Sure, I'll give you a moment to do that. And again, just reminding our audience, you can send us your comments and questions at any time during the presentation. So. All right, well, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, just to give a little roadmap of the talk, I'm just going to give a definition of conjure, then talk a little bit about how I see Hopkins' Conjuring kinship in the novel. From there, talk a little bit about how we might think about conjure in relationship to Black theology, particularly the idea of heresy or Gnosticism, and then just conclude things. So yeah, conjure. Conjure is an African-American magical tradition of healing and harming that provides a means of transforming reality. Magic in Theo Smith's understanding in his book, Conjuring Culture, is a cognitive system for mapping and managing the world in the form of signs. Rather than consider such phenomena merely irrational or marginal, to be relegated to the unintelligible realm of the supernatural or to the heterodox realm of the occult, Smith sees magic in terms of a primordial and enduring system of communication as a form of language. So part of my argument is that we can see one resonance in Hopkins' kind of promiscuous approach to the use of different forms of knowledges and traditions of practice and thought. Both her use of Orthodox kind of Christian images and tropes and ideas, but also scientific and medical ideas, and how she kind of blends those together with the occult sciences, as she calls them, and also ideas of mysticism and mesmerism that transgress the boundaries of the normative and legitimated forms of knowledge and practice. So I'm curious to know how well my method of exposition of this novel works, because there's truly so much happening in the plot. It's hard to summarize, but I'm going to try out giving a really brief synopsis of the story and then kind of building in the analysis of Conjure to the larger unfolding of some of the novel's mysteries. And I hope that that helps to both elaborate how I'm thinking about Conjure in relationship to the novel, but also the novel's production itself, what I see Hopkins doing, and also what happens in the plot. So Of One Blood, or The Hidden Self, follows the story of Ruel Briggs on his journey of self-discovery that travels from America to Africa, on the way revealing both the promise and horrors of the blood that make up the US national and Afro-diasporic community in the wake of racial slavery. Hopkins's title references both Acts 17:26, which says, "Of one blood I've made all nations of man to dwell upon the whole face of the earth," and also references William James' work, The Hidden Self. So Hopkins herself, this novel was written in 1902. Hopkins herself was a very wide-read person and often read a lot of history and ethnology, and as well as things like science and new science, as well as like works in religious studies and philosophy and psychology. So she kind of takes all of that, and you can see that in the novel and the kind of sources she assembles together to create it. So perhaps one of the biggest figurations of Conjuring in the novel is the protagonist, Ruel. He's a Black man passing out of fear of not being afforded access to an education and employment opportunities. Ruel's a medical doctor and a mystic who expresses a deep weariness of the world and even at times suicidality. Save for his best friend, the white medical doctor in training, Aubrey Livingston Jr., Ruel is figured as a loner and a genius, celebrated by, but also on the outside of the medical community. And Hopkins kind of depicts this as a racial melancholy. Ruel and his situation as a biracial Black man who's passing kind of has this existential angst about him, that and this journey of self-discovery and kind of discovering his racial history and racial roots kind of serves to awaken him from his lack of liveliness or vitality. So Ruel's fate unfolds when by chance he's called to the hospital to assess the condition of a young, ostensibly white woman who everyone fears is dead. Using his knowledge of the occult sciences, Ruel perceives her true condition as one, not of death, but of the loss of vitality, and he restores her to life. So here, Ruel's position as a medical doctor, who also has a matrilineal penchant for mysticism in the occult, resonates with Theo Smith's depiction of the conjurer in Black conjure traditions as not only a magician, but also a kind of doctor. And you can see this throughout Hopkins' novel, where Ruel is regularly traversing the natural and the supernatural, the medical and the mystical. And he also is kind of figured as both a doctor and this kind of healer in a way that exceeds the bounds of natural medicine or scientific medicine. This results in some tensions for Ruel in his relationship to the medical community. So for instance, Ruel's regularly kind of having to defend his interest in the cult. And he says things like, I believe that if we could but strengthen our mental sight, we could discover the broad highway between this and the other world, on which both good and evil travel to earth. For my own part, I've never believed that the whole mental world is governed by the faculties we understand and can reduce to reason or definite feelings. Similarly, after reviving the young woman, Diane, who comes to play a bigger role in the novel as it goes on, he revives her with what he calls volatile magnetism, which exists in the free atmosphere, explaining what he's doing as he's reviving Diane. Another doctor says, your theory smacks of the supernatural, Dr. Bridge, charlatanism or dreams of lunacy. To which Ruel responds, the supernatural presides over man's formation always. Perhaps the superstitious masses came nearer to solving the mysteries of creation than the favored elect will ever come. So there's an interesting convergence here where the medical establishment is portrayed as the favored elect, right, figuring the scientific with this religious imagery. And at the same time, Briggs is suggesting that the superstitious masses have some kind of knowledge of healing and healing properties that perhaps the medical world is not able to perceive. So upon reviving his patient, Diane, Ruel and Aubrey, his best friend, recognize her as this young woman who is traveling with the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And so they realize that, she's a Black woman who's light enough to pass. And so Ruel convinces Aubrey to conceal the secret of her racial identity because Ruel has this kind of magnetic attraction to Diane. Diane is portrayed as the singer with a kind of charismatic voice that transfixes everyone whenever she sings. And so Ruel soon falls in love with Dianthe, and now that she's revived, she's kind of fallen in love with her protector as well. So they get engaged. And this is where the novel gets like truly bananas, because what's slowly and eerily revealed in the gothic tones and sentimental drama of Hopkins' novel is that Ruel, Dianthe, and Aubrey are actually all siblings. And rather than his faithful best friend, Aubrey is actually Ruel's villain brother, plotting to remove him from the picture so that he can have Dianthe all for himself. Having plotted to remove all of Ruel's job prospects, Ruel is kind of forced to take employment on an African expedition that Aubrey has gone to great lengths to secure. This leaves Aubrey and Dianthe together in the US, and Ruel has left Dianthe in under Aubrey's protection, because he's his best friend, and Aubrey says that he'll protect her like a brother, which is some great foreshadowing on the part of Hopkins. But after Ruel's departure, Aubrey has grand designs for taking possession of Dianthe as his own wife. He murders his own fiance and fakes Dianthe's death so that he's able to return with Dianthe to his family plantation in the South so that they can live as husband and wife. And what Hopkins is doing in this story and this incest narrative is drawing on this kind of tradition of abolitionist and post-Reconstruction era discourses that would talk about the problems of slavery, its kind of morally degrading effects because of its damning effects on kinship relations. And so this fear of relatives unknowingly marrying each other was really prevalent in the 19th century and early 20th century. And Hopkins has both a kind of blessing in disguise of Ruel and Dianthe nearly marrying, but they don't get to consummate, or marrying, but they don't get to consummate their marriage. But that incest is actualized in her marriage to Aubrey. So at the same time, this drama of incest is being revealed in America, Ruel's expedition in Africa is revealing the wonders of ancient Black Ethiopian and Egyptian civilizations, including a rumored hidden city, Telsar, that was rumored to possess some of the greatest mysteries of existence. So while Dianthe is discovering the mysteries of the siblings' incestuous love triangle, Ruel is discovering the mysteries of the siblings' rich African past, which is passed down from their mother, and his own position as an heir to the throne. He is discovered to be the reappearance of the Nubian king Ergomenes. And so part of what happens is while Ruel's on this expedition, the lead archaeologist is explaining all these informations about the ancient African civilization of Meroe, which is modern day Sudan, and begins to talk about this hidden city of Telsar. And he mentions how the royal line in that city was said to have a lotus-shaped flower on their breast. And so Ruel has that birthmark, as do Dianthe and Aubrey. And he kind of is startled by that, but eventually he stumbles into the hidden city and is discovered to be the king returned. So there's a really interesting narrative of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism built into this journey of self-discovery as well. Part of what I think is interesting about what Hopkins does here is she has these kind of dual narratives of blood going on and the revelation of the kind of mysteries of blood going on. So we have this kind of incest narrative and the revelation of the incest that is an effect of racial slavery. And then we also have this narrative of discovery of African royalty and this kind of discovery of royal blood. What's interesting to me is that Hopkins doesn't really try to distinguish a good blood from a bad blood. right? She has this recurring line quoting this passage from Acts, of one blood, God has made all the nations, or as she translates it, all the races of the earth. And there's something interesting about the sense of a universal kind of brotherhood or universal oneness of blood that both represents the monstrous intimacies, as Christina Sharp calls them, of racial slavery and its effects on kinship, as well as a kind of like universal brotherhood and imagination of civilization and the grandness of African contributions to civilization. And so there's an interesting mixture of like a promise of blood and the promise of Ruel's kind of discovery of his African origins, as well as the threat or like horror of blood and the horror of a kind of oneness of blood. So blending together the royal African line and the planter class, Hopkins figures these conflicts of kinship and power through many mystical practices, including those like mesmerism, which was a kind of popular practice of the 19th century where people would get put into trances and kind of controlled and things like that. But as descendants of Mira, this enslaved woman, and Aubrey Livingston Sr., who is the plantation owner, all of the siblings are portrayed as having inherited these powers of mesmerism. So mesmerism here, again, serves as a kind of recurring image for both the charismatic power of attraction, that is a power that Ruel uses to stay connected to Diantha and eventually is able to see that she's in danger and that Aubrey has decided to marry her. And so Ruel just goes back to America to try to save her before she dies, because she was trying to poison Aubrey, and then Aubrey used mesmerism to actually make her drink the poison herself. So as I said, this is a very bananas plot. Really amazing novel though. But this mesmerism is seen as both this power of attraction that is used to kind of create a positive sibling bond, but it also serves as an image for the controlling power of the plantation master on the sexual violence and domination that racial slavery established as a norm of Black intimate life. So I think there's something interesting happening too here in how Hopkins refuses to distinguish a good mesmerism from a bad mesmerism, right? Hopkins shows how the very same power that enables Ruel to reunite with this royal matrilineal civilization is the same kind of power that also is really dominating and controlling and violating of his mother and also his sister. So Hopkins kind of exposes these like double legacies of healing and harm throughout the novel that are colored through the discourse and figure of blood. So I think that represents one of the deep resonances with conjural traditions as well. That conjure is not simply a positive or negative practice or tradition, right? It's this tradition of healing and harm, and it kind of employs things multiply. So her refusal to provide a purely redemptive form of kinship or knowledge or practices, I think can be understood in terms of something like heresy or gnosis, and help illuminate a Black approach to the reproduction of knowledge and impure ideas of kinship. So this, I think, is my attempt to do a kind of Black feminist reading of loss and kinship in political theological terms in Hopkins. And I take her use of these theological tropes and biblical passages and images of prophecy as a way of trying to contend with the loss of kinship that a Christian kind of colonialism and New World project installs for Black people. And she also provides a way of showing how to seriously contend with how Black people have appropriated these materials, both Christian theological materials, but also other Western kind of materials of knowledge and thought. So I think she shows how to repeat them in a kind of wayward way, rather than expressing them as a kind of desire for pure origins. She shows that there's an impossibility of purity, or impossibility of a kind of pure redemption in the blood. So these proliferating plot lines, coupled with the proliferation of knowledges and their mixture, I think get at how Hopkins brings together the biblical, the occultic, and the scientific along the way of this adventure. And I think this gets at how conjure in historical practice made really interesting use of Christian theological materials, of Christian supernatural materials, as well as kind of other naturally available materials. So Yvonne Chareau talks about how Christian accoutrements were utilized in unusual ways by African-American conjurers. A common procedure for divination used by slaves involved the use of a Bible for the detection of criminals. And rather than understanding conjure as kind of purely distinct from Christianity, Chareau says that when we look at these traditions of practice, we can actually see that there is often an attempt to kind of reconcile their views together, or that in practice, conjure and kind of Christianity were being employed together by the same practitioners. And she also talks about how lore and images from the Christian Bible provided fertile territory from which African-American specialists could acquire conjuring materials. And I think this idea of the acquisition of conjuring materials and thinking about Christian theological materials, or Christian theology in terms of materials, is really helpful for rethinking what something like Black theology could be, rather than understanding it as a kind of confessional practice. Understanding it in terms of conjure would help think about the kind of creative accumulation of materials that are used to express healing and at times harming transformations of reality through Black culture and Black cultural practice. So to me, this is my, I think, attempt to think with and to and extend D. Smith's idea of Black culture as a conjuring culture. And in his book, he is kind of trying to talk about how Black Americans have this unique combination of biblical interpretation with magical transformation. I think this is really helpful analytic for reading Hopkins' literary production in terms of conjure. I think she shows that against the purity of kind of kinship and the knowledge that kind of coincides with this racial order of purity and kinship, Hopkins shows that the distinctiveness of fields of knowledge is less these boundaried sets of domains, but is more about unique and different kind of procedures of thought, and that these procedures of thought require both different kinds of evaluation, but also require different openness to senses of mystery and senses of the unknown, senses of the hidden being revealed. So rather than seeing knowledge in terms of racial ideas of purity and trying to distinguish the purity of some thought from others, I see Hopkins in her use of On One Blood and her attempts to conjure an alternative idea of kinship that shows that the blood is both, as Hortense Spiller says, the remedy and the poison, rather than trying to distinguish that. Her idea of kinship also, I think, translates into a creative idea of knowledge and the impurity of knowledge as well. Let's see. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's another thing that I'm missing, but I'm also noticing the time. And so I think I will just close by saying part of what I think is interesting about what Hopkins is doing here is thinking about the natural and supernatural in terms that are not conflictual with one another. I think there's often a way that the religious and the theological and the spiritual are kind of left out of many contemporary Black studies theorizations of Black culture. And so to me, something else that Hopkins provides is a really interesting way of bringing those things together, the natural and the supernatural, and showing how there's a Black tradition of conjure can, I think, serve to highlight the invention and novelty and innovation with which Black cultural practice and Black conjuring culture has been taking up the terms of racial order and reworking them. So I think I'll stop there. But thank you all for having me. I'm excited to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Maria. That's really fascinating. Several things I would be eager to hear more about. Again, inviting our audience to please share with us any of your comments or questions that you might have. Well, we will be happy to pose those to Professor Armstrong. I'd love to actually just start with a question about this very fascinating novel. You're right, there's lots of pieces and elements here. You've summarized well some of the fantastical developments that Pauline Hopkins produces in this novel. I mean, just wonder if you could just say a little about the significance of Hopkins herself in the context. You know, she is one of the really important authors who is very active before the period known as the Harlem Renaissance. So she's doing several things and produces quite a bit of work. But could you just start with a little bit of what makes her so important and unique in that way? And then I have another question about some things going on with the genre itself. But.
Absolutely. So Pauline Hopkins, she's an extremely important writer. She was very prolific writer as well. So she often wrote in the style of the serial novel, which Of One Blood was as well. And this came out in the Colored American magazine, which she also served as one of the editors for a long time, until I believe it was one of Booker T. Washington's kind of proteges took over the magazine, and they were unhappy with how Hopkins was running things. So she gets pushed out, and I think that's a really interesting history there. Cedric Robinson actually has a really interesting essay on Pauline Hopkins and her use of the detective novel as a kind of Pan-Africanism that maybe was at odds with Booker T. Washington's kind of racial politics. But she also worked as a stenographer, and I think there's a lot of interesting things about her method of writing that come through in this kind of seriality or kind of shorthandedness, that it feels like part of why all these materials are brought together is they each serve as shorthands for something bigger. Each serve as kind of like figures of a denser, more broad conversation. So I think Hopkins is a really fascinating writer and somebody who I think would be interesting to talk more about in religious studies in particular.
Well, could you also say something about your use of a fiction in your research on these historical developments that pertain to race and gender? You probably take this a little for granted now because you've been doing it for a while, but it's not necessarily obvious to everyone that if you are trying to figure out the historical developments and trying to interpret things that really happen, why use stories about things that never happened?
Yeah, that's a fun question. So I think a lot of this is related to my being influenced by Claudia Tate and Hortense Spillers, as well as a lot of other Black feminist literary scholars who really talk about how in the 19th century, with the rise of more and more Black kind of literary traditions, and you finally have like Black women writers in a more prolific way, like many Black women weren't in the public in the way that other kind of Black male political figures were. So these domestic novels of the 19th century were one of the main ways, along with a lot of these magazines like the Colored American magazine. These kind of pamphlets and kind of domestic treatises were many of the places that Black women were expressing their ideas about politics and race and religion and psychology. And you can kind of see that in Hopkins' work, right? She's not just kind of telling a fake story or something like that. She's doing a lot of political work. She's trying to kind of challenge these ideas of Black history as kind of, or Black people as having like no history or no kind of historical contribution to civilization. At the same time, she's kind of trying to challenge these rising authority of things like racial science. At the same time, the kind of racial Christianity and its kind of ideas of Black inferiority are all being challenged as well in the novel. And at the same time, I think she's doing a lot of her own interesting intellectual work just in synthesizing a lot of the things that she's been reading, whether that's in psychology or philosophy or ethnology. And she's developing her own theories of existence. And to me, it's really interesting to read someone like Hopkins, not just for what she exposes about like that particular historical moment, but I think her ideas themselves are interesting. So I think if we only take, the kind of concrete historical facts as the place where significant knowledge is being made, we miss out on a lot.
Yeah, no, that's important. Well, do we have any sense of how writers responded to some of these things? You've already explained some of the complex meanings that attended conjure, for example. It was not considered or esteemed as a legitimate form of religion, but seen more as a uninformed folk style religion. And so that's one of the issues at work here. But do we have any sense of how readers responded to Hopkins in her own time, particularly because she is very deliberate in how she portrays some of these issues that you talked about, the representation of Africana history. So she's, as you noted, she's trying to portray these East African civilizations as not being products of external influence, but rather as cradles of civilization and culture. And that was later continually affirmed by historical research. But she's sort of early in that tradition and was, what she was doing was very questionable at that time. And then also the representation of religion here. But how did people respond to her in her own time?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Something I haven't always found a lot of information about. So many people will talk about who it seems like Hopkins is influenced by. Like many people talk about her being influenced by W.B. Du Bois, and perhaps that has something to do with, the kind of Booker T. Washington fallout as well. But I see little about, the popularity of her novels. At the same time, she published a lot of them. So I think there was definitely a readership for them. So she's got, I think, 2 or 3 other serial novels, and then one novel that was not a serial novel, in addition to a host of short stories as well, and 2 nonfiction books that were kind of histories of Black civilization, and as well as, I believe, an attempt to kind of debunk racial science and ethnology as well. So she's a very prolific writer, and definitely had, I think, an audience for her writing, in that much of it was published in something like the Colored American magazine. But I don't know. I don't know a lot of people who are familiar with her work kind of just in everyday life. So it's also hard to say how well known she is.
Well, she's certainly known well by experts.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to your point, there is a popularity to some of these authors who are the so-called Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance writers who come later, that are that are more well known than Pauline Hopkins is people who are non-experts. And so if if you name some of these other people who produce work in the later periods in the 20s and 30s and 40s, then Zora Neale Hurston, for example, is much more widely read, right?
Yeah.
But she's earlier. She's active earlier than Hurston, and
Absolutely.
she's really foundational for some of these authors. And as you said, the Colored American magazine, it was trying to promote more literary activity among African Americans, and even Hopkins herself is somewhat inspired by an author who had been enslaved, William Wells Brown, who emerged from slavery and survived that experience and became a published author in the 1800s. And so it's interesting to see some of these earlier writers and how they are becoming very important for people who might be better known later, but who are actually beneficiaries of some of the work that they're doing. Well, one of the questions I had was about some of the changes that occur with the legibility of reproduction, of Black reproduction particularly, because that's, of course, a very central thing in your work and your engagement with authors such as Spillers. So Hopkins is active, late 1800s and early 1900s. Several things are going on in that context. This is post-Reconstruction era. There's lots of changes in particularly the proliferation of so-called anti-miscegenation laws. These are laws against racial mixture, and really more specifically against legitimizing those forms, making it illegal for Blacks and non-Blacks to marry. And there are these efforts to try to ensure the racial purity. Many states were part of that throughout the US. Virginia was no exception. This is a global phenomenon. It's not just the US. But I'm wondering what patterns or shifts you have observed in your research that are relevant to Hopkins' time that might have informed some of the dynamics that she was experiencing working with.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think some place that has been showing up for me, and I'm also teaching or co-teaching a class right now called Kin, Feminist Theories of Race and Reproduction. Mm-hmm. And something we have been talking about in the past few weeks has been the relationship between incest and amalgamation in the American imagination, and how racial slavery kind of establishes this homology between incest and amalgamation. So there's something interesting I think Hopkins is doing as well in delinking racial mixture, the kind of impurity of blood from this threat of incest, while also showing that racial slavery as a form of dominance is also like what kind of would produce the conditions that would lead to something like incest. But I think one line of thought that I'm really interested in taking is the kind of psychological aspect, because I think Hopkins is doing something really interesting here with consciousness and with existence and these ideas of existentialism that feels resonant with, the emergence around this time as well of things like psychoanalysis and Du Bois and double consciousness. And I think there's a really interesting convergence of explanations of kinship and, this kind of universal Oedipal narrative around desire, et cetera. And what Hopkins is trying to do here in kind of challenging the kind of fear of amalgamation in the American imagination by kind of providing a different narrative of kinship and showing how that relates to a different kind of Black consciousness. So I think there's a lot of interesting developments in this period around how Black people are thinking about the psyche and its relationship to race and racial order, and expressing ideas of Blackness and spirit, and that are also related to ideas of like haunting and kind of challenging these fantasies of blood and that are appearing in both ideas of racial science and also kinds of traditionally more religious or theological ideas.
Great. We have another question here from our audience members is asking, is there any connection on this psychological themes between Hopkins and William James, who was a contemporary of hers, focusing on psychology?
So she loved William James. She was a big reader of William James. And actually, the subtitle of On Film and Blood is The Hidden Self, which is a reference to a work by William James. And throughout the novel as well, there are quotes taken from works by William James, as well as other psychologists of the period. So Hopkins was really, really interested in his ideas and kind of used Of One Blood as a way of kind of incorporating her kind of interpretation of his works into this kind of race consciousness.
Another question from the audience is the concept of passing in this novel seen as a form of racism or empowerment? And that's seen by whom is one question, is by the author or by interpreters? Yeah. Could you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think it feels very clear to me that Hopkins kind of depicts Ruel's passing as it's something regrettable, right? So at the end of the novel, having kind of returned to his roots and discovered his kind of true connection to this ancient African civilization, he himself kind of admits to being ashamed of having passed, and it talks about how, even though it would have been difficult, he would have been able to find a way. So as I see it, and this is something Hazel Carvey talks about in her work, a lot of writers, especially Black women writing at this time, are using the figure of the mulatto as a way of exploring the dynamics of racism and how, like, the function of race, and how this figure allows them to kind of reveal many of the ways that race kind of orchestrates itself, or the ways that race gets managed. And rather than kind of taking it as a claim about identity necessarily, they often use it to kind of reveal these hidden ways that race is working. So I think in this novel, part of what Hopkins is doing is showing its effects, its like psychic effects in some sense, in order to develop, I think, a narrative of like Black empowerment and racial empowerment and kind of racial pride. At the same time, I think she is also trying to highlight how this sense of purity and impurity, right, depends on the structure of kind of like visibility and hiddenness. So throughout the novel, she's talking about or quoting biblical passages about all things that are hidden will be revealed, and things like that. So I think she's trying to, at the same time, like indict this racial order that kind of fabricates this idea of purity. So through this figure of the mulatto, I think she's able to really use this kind of revelatory narrative throughout to show, like, actually, like, this purity of the blood that is being posited by this racial order is a fiction. And so Ruel kind of serves to like illuminate that. At the same time, he's this figure, I think, of a kind of Black racial consciousness.
Yeah, well, this is very fascinating. We're close to our time now, but there's quite a bit to appreciate from what you've been able to explain in the work of Pauline Hopkins, and also just elucidating these larger connected issues of the attempt to portray an Africana past, of understanding systems of kinship and blood and gender. Really excited to see you doing this work, and looking forward to more to come as you're developing these book projects. So thank you so much, Professor Armstrong, for taking time. Yeah, for taking time to share your work with us. I want to thank those of you who have been attending these talks and joining us remotely. and for your questions and comments as well. And again, a reminder that on Thursday of this week, the same time, we'll have Professor Philip Yare talking about the work of Frederick Douglass. So we hope you'll join us for that. And until next time, take care. Thanks very much.